Welcome back to DIY Garage. I'm your host, Carey Holzman, and joining us today we have JJ from ASUS. Hey, JJ.
How you doing?
I'm great, thanks, especially when you're here. One of my favorite guests we have here.
Thank you.
And, well, thank you, because today we're getting into something I know a lot of our viewers have requested, they were looking forward to, and me too. We're going to talk about overclocking.
Yes, we
Now,
definitely are.
I realize many of our viewers know what overclocking is, but for those who don't, to put it simply, basically when we're buying a computer, often we're looking at how fast that computer is. What's the speed of it? Sometimes it's referred to as frequency. I've heard you call it frequency.
Yep.
I always refer to it as speed. So bigger the number, the faster it goes.
Generally, yes.
Generally. There are some exceptions, but without getting into all the technical detail, overclocking is basically pushing the CPU. A lot of people think it's just the CPU. We're going to clarify that in a minute. But they often think of it as just the CPU pushing it beyond its rated speed. So the system will run faster. There's actually more to it than that.
Yeah. Overall, I mean, when we look at overclocking, there's actually multiple components within a modern enthusiast system that you can overclock. You've got your CPU, you have your DRAM or your memory, and you've got your graphics cards. And ultimately, what you're trying to do there is get more performance out of that, right? You're trying to get, faster gaming, reduce your encoding or your rendering times. Ultimately, you're just trying to get a better experience. And so, like you said, this ultimately comes in the form of increasing the frequency that each one of those components is running at so that you can get better performance.
And just like a car, you run it too fast.
You can run into issues. There's definitely problems, and there's a lot of complexities, a lot of sometimes insight that's required into overclocking, and that's why we want to be able to give you guys a little bit of breakdown that if you're looking to be able to overclock an X99 based system, so the highest end that Intel offers right now, what are some of the options you have available to you both manually as well as automatically?
On ASUS motherboards.
That's right.
So what ASUS motherboard do we have here?
This system right here is going to be utilizing an X99 based board. It's a RAMPAGE 5 series. We've got a 6950K series processor in there, so that's the latest generation Broadwell-E. We've got some awesome Avexor DDR4 based memory in there that does support higher frequencies than the traditional base SPD memory profile of 2133. And then rounding it out, although we're not going to be overclocking it, we have a STRIX GTX 1080.
All right, now, given all that information, how do we overclock?
So you've got two options. One is going to be in the classic traditional method. Some people refer to it as BIOS-based overclocking, but technically it is UEFI-based overclocking. And then your newer approach is going to be a combination of firmware, software, and actually hardware through the operating system. But first and foremost, we're going to go through the classic-oriented way of overclocking.
So the classic way is often seen by many people as very intimidating and complicated.
There's definitely a lot of different parameters that you have to be kind of cognizant of. In every generation, Intel, along with us, we do a lot of refinement to the different parameters that you can use to be able to overclock. So you're talking about different things from voltage parameters to understanding multipliers and cache ratios, different bus frequencies, timings, a lot of different pieces go into the mix. Now, once you jump into the UEFI, you're usually going to be looking at an interface like this. And so you're going to generally find a section on ASUS boards, and actually pretty much anybody's board, that's going to say something along the lines of extreme tweaking or clock frequency adjustments, things along those lines. And historically, how you would go about implementing your overclock is going to be first and foremost looking at what you call the multiplier. And so you can see right here we have the CPU core ratio. And all the way at the top of actually this board, you can see that we have a target CPU frequency.
Maximum speed?
Right, so that's essentially the maximum speed that we'd be looking at. Now this CPU actually, his maximum default speed is 3.5 gigahertz, but this being an ASUS RG series board, there's some things that we already put in play that allow you to get better than stock performance right off the bat.
Wow. Okay.
But if we went from the 3.5 being essentially our maximum frequency, what we'd want to do is traditionally go over to the multiplier and define the multiplier. So we could, let's say, select 4.2 gigahertz. That's what we would want to go ahead and select, and you can see that will change that.
Now, changing that doesn't guarantee you're going to get that.
Correct. You could put any number in there. So we could put 50 if we wanted
you
to.
have to sort of experiment with. I mean, how do you know what number to put in there?
There is actually there's no way to know, and that's part of the challenge of a manual overclocking pursuit. Is that every CPU is different. You have what's called the silicon lottery. You could build 10 of the exact same systems, and you could have 5 different results across all of these systems. Some might run at maybe 3.8 if they're a very low performing overclocker, and some might actually perform at 4.4 if it's a really great overclocker for, let's say, this 6950 series, right? So you have a lot of variables, and really the only way to try it is you have to go incrementally. So if we were to go the traditional route, we're not going to go through every single step, but if we wanted to go through and test it, ideally you would want to put 3.6 as being Your first attempt, just 100 megahertz
Really?
over.
You're just going to do 100 megahertz at a time? You just
Yep.
keep ramping it up?
That's correct.
Until it crashes,
and you would
then you back it down.
Yeah, because if you jump too high, you don't know whether it's a limitation based on voltage. You don't know if it's a limitation that's based purely on the CPU having a
Just
ceiling.
can't start at, say, 10%.
Yeah, it's
just not going to work that way.
It's just not
Or
going to work that way.
5%.
You could, but ultimately, I think it adds more variability that it becomes harder to account for. Thus, if you start with smaller steps, it becomes easier to know. Okay, that's where I need to adjust
where
from.
it went wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
So beyond that, you do have options that you can define what's called all cores or just specific cores. In Intel's most modern generation CPUs, they do have the ability that essentially you can do what's called per core overclocking. A lot of users don't think about this, but the benefit is essentially when you go to an all core overclock, let's say here, if we wanted them all to go to 4 gigahertz, right? There actually might be maybe a couple of cores that could operate at 4.2 gigahertz. But not all of them could operate at that frequency. So what Intel allowed for is essentially having per core overclocking. This allowed us to maybe selectively set that if we wanted to have 2 threads be maybe 4.1 and then just 1 thread 4.2, that's great because there's actually a lot of applications that are still out there and even some games that are generally only using 1 thread or maybe 2 threads.
Right.
So this is just a way of further extracting a bit more performance out of your CPU. Now beyond that, once you've defined that, there are other areas that you don't need to worry about on ASUS boards, but there's things like your cache ratio, which has to do with the efficiency of your CPU overclock, and generally the higher that you can keep this value in line with your multiplier, the better performance you get. But we're not going to worry about it making an adjustment to that. You of course also have your DRAM frequency where you could select the corresponding frequency that you want to set your memory to. But usually most users are going to set an XMP related value. So that's going to be whatever it's been programmed into the memory kit you buy. So if you got like a 2666 or 2800 or 3000 memory kit, you would essentially just run at that frequency.
Extreme memory profile?
That's correct.
XMP.
Mm-hmm.
So you people who are purchasing parts, if you see that XMP on the RAM and you're wondering why it might be a little more money than the non-XMP memory, and you're not planning to overclock, probably don't need to spend the money on the XMP memory.
That's correct. If you're definitely not planning to even enable the XMP profile, you're essentially not using the memory to the effect that it's been designed for.
Good to know. All right. Well, you know, I still think all this is pretty complicated. I mean, you can go into menus and sub-menus into this. I mean, we're just kind of scratching the surface here and get down into real granular, real technical.
So you're definitely right, but there's actually even more to it than that because we haven't even talked about voltages, which have consistently gotten more complicated actually as we've gotten to newer generations of CPUs because Intel's implemented some actually really beneficial options. But traditionally what most users would think about just as what's referred to as a static or a manual voltage has now reached the point that if you're not using a manual VID, you actually have an offset VID or an adaptive voltage. And you'd essentially have to figure out, you know, which is the right voltage, how do you want to define that so that you can essentially get that best balance of not only giving the voltage to the speed that you want to achieve so that you reach your stability, but also not necessarily putting more than you might need or considering how that affects things like thermals and power consumption. So there's definitely a lot of different aspects that that come into play when you're going about manually overclocking your system.
And this is the thing about overclocking, that for people who don't understand what it is, no 2 CPUs are the same. So you can't just plug some values in there, theoretically, I suppose, unless they're really minimal, and expect it to work just fine. It requires time and experimentation. But you told me this was easier. This looks more complicated to me.
Yeah, well, I would say on a face value, because we're here also trying to give a little bit of a primer to our users, I can say that at least with ASUS series boards, we do have what are called auto rules that are built in. And so this can streamline a lot of the process. So let's just go from base perspective. If they wanted a recommended value for kind of this series CPU and they wanted to adjust it, they could just set the XMP. Once they go to the XMP,
now the XMP value you just get off the box of your RAM, right?
Actually, it's already programmed into the memory chip, so you don't even need to reference it. You just select the XMP.
And it just automatically fills in this information.
Correct. Now, for our XMP profile, it's also going to automatically set the CPU core multiplier for us. So it's all good. But if we want to, I would recommend that actually in our testing, almost all of Broadwell-E CPUs will at least hit 4 gigahertz. So you could set 40 as your essentially as your target value, right? And then from there, you could go and also just keep it set to a manual voltage. While it's definitely not the most efficient by any stretch, we could go from a baseline of doing 1.325. Once you're done from there, you can confirm your settings. So you'd scroll back up to the top. you'd see that that's there, and you'd hit F10 and you'd apply. But keep in mind that there's all those other things that we already talked about, and like you were about to note, there is actually, I feel, quite a bit of an easier way to go about this that actually gives you a lot of more, I'd say, customizable options that make sense to how users look at using their system, and that's through our auto-tuning technology, which is in the operating system.
Well, that's really what I'm interested in, because I feel like anybody who knows how to overclock already knows this.
Right.
And those who don't are really intimidated by this. So let's show the easy way that it can be done, that anybody can do it. That's what I want to see.
All right, well, let's go ahead and let's jump into the operating system. So load up our defaults and let's boot into Windows.
Okay, so now we've booted into Windows. We've got Windows 10 here. I guess it's the anniversary edition. I guess that doesn't matter.
It wouldn't matter. Yes, this software is fully compatible with Windows 8, 8.1, as well as Windows 10.
Okay, and then the software is, I guess, on the driver disk that comes with the motherboard.
Correct, and this is software that works actually across our entire range of X99 series motherboards. So even if you have our entry X99-A board, you're still going to fully be able to realize this all the way up to our flagship RAMPAGE series motherboard.
All right, let's bring the software up. What's the software called?
It's called AI Suite 3, so it runs automatically there in your system tray. Because it's inclusive, it does a lot of other things as well. It's not just for overclocking. But once we open up, we're going to have this button right here at the top that says 5-way optimization. So we're going to go ahead and click on that, and then the first thing you're going to be presented with is a couple of different options that relate to how you're going to be able to tune the tune the CPU. So we're going to select extreme tuning, which essentially is the highest level of overclocking that we offer. And now you'll see that we give you those actually two options that we were talking about in the UI5.
Yep.
You can go towards all core, or you can define per core. So we're going to go ahead and choose just an all core overclock. Okay. And then from there, you can see that if you want to start your overclock, we actually have two options. ASUS's optimal ratio essentially just means that it will start from what we've defined as generally being the quickest way to go through this auto overclocking process.
Okay.
What this actually generally means is that we will usually define a slight overclock that we've pretty much tested on all CPUs that we know we can start from, instead of starting you from pure stock.
Okay.
But if you wanted to essentially have the most complete and validated overclock that's specific to your CPU, you could start at whatever ratio you wanted to. So if you wanted to start, purely from the base, you could start from the base, or if you wanted to go for more aggressive, you could select that. So it's really up to you. It's a very straightforward process. Now, some of the things that are very interesting is that maybe if you're, you and me, we both do a little bit of editing when we have to do some YouTube content, different things like that. If you want to have actually a much higher level of stability, because most users don't realize that there's different levels of stability based on applications you run. Web browsers, general applications, and even games aren't as demanding as what you're going to do when you go about full transcoding, rendering, and editing on a system. So if you're going to be doing things like that, you can actually select an encode stability. This, along with another option that we have built into our application, which includes what's called AVX. AVX is a special instruction set that's only found in very high-end specialized applications, like Adobe Premiere, for instance, uses an AVX instruction set. These can be selected. This will place even more stress onto the CPU and even produce more heat. This will essentially lower probably your maximum overclock, but always with that perspective of giving you an overclock, but with the highest level of stability. So these are really easy options that you can define, and of course when you're in the UEFI, you don't have anything like this that you can even think about. You have to own this, because you have to think about this by loading applications into the operating system to be able to do this type of stress testing.
What about the enable memory stress test there?
That's also a fairly new addition that we've brought into the auto-tuning process, but it's great because what many people don't realize is that when you overclock a system, you can be adjusting the memory frequency. And actually, in fact, for us, we automatically apply your XMP profile for your memory. But there is actually going to be some situations that when you overclock your CPU and your memory, it can lead to instability. And this is due to the fact that the memory controller doesn't necessarily always run at the highest frequencies when the CPU is also running at high frequency. So if we give a reference example, let's say your CPU runs at 3.5 gigahertz. The memory controller may be able to run at, let's say, 3400 megahertz, but that's only with the CPU running at 3.5. If you were to overclock it to, let's say, 4 gigahertz, the memory controller may no longer be able to reach that high frequency, and it might maybe only run at a maximum of 2800.
Interesting. Okay.
So what we can help to do is essentially validate that your memory is also stable. So by clicking this, we will simultaneously not only be stress testing the CPU, running specialized instruction sets, but we're also going to stress test your memory at the same time.
And just to be clear, you don't have to have the XMP memory to overclock memory, right?
Correct.
XMP memory is designed to be overclocked.
Actually, it's not just designed to be overclocked. It's already pre-validated at that overclock frequency.
Okay.
That's what you're paying for. Essentially is that if you bought an XMP kit that's rated at 3000, it's already been checked to operate running at 3000 megahertz.
Which doesn't mean you couldn't get that from
a lower frequency kit, it's just not validated.
It's not guaranteed.
To do so. Correct.
Okay.
So beyond that, some other nice options is the user can define the length of the stress test intervals. So let's say if you wanted to have the stress test literally run an hour in between each increment that we're increasing.
That's a very thorough test.
It's extremely thorough.
Yeah.
But this is to help to kind of reinforce the fact that a lot of users think that there's no legitimate stress testing that occurs when you go through an automatic fashion. This is not the case. We have set it to a value that we've tested that in probably about 85% of cases is going to generally be fully stable.
Yeah, I was going to say the best stress test is to put it back in the hands of the user and see if it crashes.
So
see if it's stable.
This allows you to do that. Now beyond that, there are of course some other options that are built into this that we don't need to worry about at this point. And these tie into what's called our full fiber optimization, where we can do things like we can optimize your power profile, we can do fan calibration, we can even go to your graphics card and we can make some adjustments in terms of its fan. But for us, we're just going to focus on the OC. So once we've defined essentially those options, you just have to click the start button and we'll go about the overclock. So let's go ahead and start that off.
All right, so the system had just restarted, actually powered completely off.
Correct, because it goes through actually a full reset. We're essentially telling the system, and many people think that, well, this is the operating system environment and that it's all software-based. This is actually all being executed directly on a hardware level. Just like if you were in the UEFI, all these changes are going to dynamically happen on a firmware level. Just like if you were in the UEFI making these adjustments, they're occurring. So when we started that overclock, we're essentially telling the board, we now need to begin this auto overclock process. So it sends that information to the board to then start this.
Now the numbers we saw in there was like 42 or something. That was our base of where we were starting the test. So we don't even know what we've got. Oh wait, something just came up right now.
Correct. So the board, remember, we started with the preset of the ASUS Optimal, right?
Right.
So that essentially works from a baseline perspective. It applied that. It told us we had, when we were booting the system, 36% overclock essentially already in effect. So you can see here essentially there's the countdown timer that's occurring. This is essentially a buffer period that we have put in place specifically because you might have other applications that are running in the background.
We're still waiting to load.
Right, and we don't necessarily just want to jump straight into continuing this automated process. So it waits a little bit, essentially 60 seconds, and then we start right up the overclock. Now you can see right here that if I were to open my task manager.
Oh, we can hear those fans spinning up.
Yep, that's because the stress test is happening in real time. If we go ahead and open this.
Now this is something you're bringing up.
Yes, this is the task manager, correct.
You don't have to bring this up.
You don't have to bring it up, but we're showing this in reference so you can actually see what's happening in real time. So you can see right there that our CPU actually shot up to full 100% because it was fully stress testing the CPU, and you heard those fans ramp up because of course the temperature was going up. And you can see now the memory usage also just went up. It's going from, normally if we were just sitting idle at the desktop, it might be like 1.5 gigs, maybe 2 gigs of memory.
It's like an idling car and you just put the pedal to the metal.
Exactly. And so now at this point, we can dynamically see in real time the temperature for our CPU. We can see the amount of voltage that's being supplied and even the amount of wattage in terms of the overall power consumption. So you see right now it's at full core stress test. It's clocking that up. We can see all this, and essentially this is all dynamically occurring. It's incrementally, just like if you were manually in the UEFI, with the exception that in the UEFI, I'd have to define a value, define a voltage, reboot, log in, stress test, crash, monitor my temperatures,
or
go
it
back.
Works fine.
Right.
Until it crashes.
Until it crashes.
Right, you keep ramping it up until it crashes. And I love all the information that's being provided to me. For some reason, when I pictured this in my head and the way you described it, I thought it was just all going to sort of happen magically. But I love how it's showing me everything that it's doing.
Yep, we've definitely tried to make the process clean and efficient, and also ultimately edify you as to what's going on in your system.
Yeah, because you don't, if you're a basic user, you don't need to know what any of this means, right?
Yep.
And now here we've got a blue screen.
Which is entirely normal. We should expect this because ultimately we're overclocking. We're going to reach a point of instability where the system crashes. So at this point, the system is essentially going to crash. It's going to shut down, but we store all that information inside the motherboard.
So it crashed.
Exactly. And once it restarts the process, it references the last point of the overclock and goes, okay, that point wasn't stable. So I need to roll back my overclock to essentially my last validated stable overclocking state.
It's amazing that can be automated.
Yep, it's taken us, literally, we've designed this software and this firmware process literally cumulatively over years.
I imagine it must be something like some kind of marker it must leave, like, okay, I passed that test, I'm going to leave a mark, because it won't know it crashed until it reboots.
Correct.
And it's got to have some sort of way to go back and go, where was I before I crashed?
That's right. Essentially, every time we validate an overclock, that's stored and registered essentially as a stable state, and then it gets registered essentially as an overclock state when we're going into uncharted territory, areas that we don't know that essentially have been validated as of yet.
So you are going to see a blue screen when you do this?
Yes, there will always be some stage. The only time wouldn't be is that if you decided to maybe pick an arbitrary frequency that would be safe.
Okay.
Or if you remember when we first started the auto-tuning process, it came up to us and asked us, do we want to stop or continue? So if you would have been happy with the with that first initial result, you could have clicked stop and you would have never experienced a blue screen.
Okay.
So last but not least, we're now back into the desktop environment. This is actually going to be essentially a configuration of the power management, which happens automatically, and at the end it gives us a report. So you can see it's completed the entirety of the overclock, and we've successfully now reached 4.3 gigahertz. So,
and this is originally how fast?
This, the baseline, remember, baseline frequency for the CPU is 3.5 gigahertz.
So we just, for free, got 800 megahertz.
800 megahertz by clicking a button and running through a couple of basic steps and letting the system
8,
go through
16, 24, 32. Is that about more than 20% increase?
It's a substantial increase in terms of the overclock frequency. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that even if you were to buy Intel's fastest CPU, it wouldn't be reaching these clock frequencies that we were able to ascertain. So all the way around, we're even unlocking a higher degree of value if you look at it from that perspective.
Well, that is something I think anybody could easily do. You don't have to have any certain level of experience or education now to overclock your system. Mm-hmm. It's now become available to the common man and common woman to be able to just click a button and do it. You have to be a little patient while it figures it out.
Right.
And then when it's done, it tells you what the result is. Now, of course, this works equally well because I see the CPU. It doesn't tell us anything about the RAM, what it was able to do?
Correct. If you did pull up actually our AI Suite application afterwards, you can actually see the registered DRAM frequency, and you'd be good to go.
Then, of course, what I would recommend would be to run whatever the most intensive application you have is as your own personal test, because I'm a see it to believe it kind of guy.
Yeah, sure.
If you want to trust the report screen. Just to verify you're okay, and if you're not, at least you've got a baseline now to move down from.
Right, and generally what we find in most situations is that if you do run into a point of instability, it's probably because you didn't check the encoding or the AVX stability tests, because those aren't enabled by default, because actually most users, all they're doing is generally gaming or general desktop applications. So if you want to ensure that you're getting that highest level overclock, go back in and enable the encoding and the AVX, because that will be the most demanding of any type of configuration that you can run.
And of course, the reason there was no option for the video card in this, there's a separate.
Correct. If you want to pursue manual overclocking for your graphics card, you can do that through like our GPU tweak utility.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you coming in and sharing this knowledge with all of us.
No problem.
Especially me in a selfish way. I love this stuff. This is fascinating. And I can't believe how something so complex was made so simple. ASUS did a great job with this. And you guys need to be aware that not every board that supports overclocking supports it in this fashion. You guys have uniquely made it very, very simple. And for that, I'm impressed.
Very cool. Well, as always, you know, we strive to be able to try to provide enthusiasts easy solutions to be able to maximize the investment in their hardware.
I'd say job done.
Thank you.
All right, job well done. That's going to wrap up this episode of DIY Garage. We hope you enjoyed it, and you can let us know by clicking the like button, and be sure to click subscribe. And of course, feel free to leave a comment in the section below. And if you'd like to see more great content from Newegg, be sure to check out our new video shopping platform at newegg.tv. For Newegg TV and DIY Garage, I'm Carey Holzman, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.